I'm Bill Hannings, and welcome again to Craft of Gaming. It's been a little while since my last episode, and for that I do apologize. I got quite sick. It was a rough situation, I will admit. I had a really nasty case of the flu and got sick in the middle of Hamilton. I'm really sorry to my sister and her boyfriend and my mom and dad, all of whom were there with me when I got extremely ill. It wasn't great. I actually lost a lot of weight. I don't recommend that method of losing weight, by the way. But with a long time of recovery, anti-nausea medication, and a little bit of return to the gym, I've gotten things under control and I'm back. So today, about 2 weeks after I'd wanted to, I'm going to answer some questions. The first three come from a friend of mine, Andy Randolph. So let's go with those questions. Number one, Andy asked me, what is your advice for exploring gender and gender expression via LARP or tabletop role-playing? Role-playing LARP or tabletop is an excellent way of exploring gender and gender expression. And I view it as a real tool for enhancing empathy. If you're like a cis dude like me, I've actively written characters as women, and in tabletop primarily, I've attempted to genuinely role-play from the experience of a woman. Not what I might assume the experience of a woman to be like, but by consulting, asking, and listening to women. Folks are folks, and you can generally move with a lot of the same motivations as a guy or a non-binary person, depending on society and what the game world is in. But it's going to vary. But it's a really good way of putting yourself in the mind of someone you're not, if that's something you want to experience within a tabletop. I'm covering that a little bit first because LARP is a big and different world, and one that I really endorse. Obviously, I do it, but while I haven't explored this avenue myself, I've seen a lot of folks experiment with gender expression and exploring what that means at LARP. And I can't recommend it more. I've seen so many folks that are, maybe closeted, either trans or non-binary, actually explore the identity that's true, that is true to their concept and themselves at a LARP first, because it's a safer place. My advice there is start with making and outfitting a character as you would normally, and if your game allows it, by all means, please, for yourself. And this goes for everyone who's playing, whatever, playing a character, a character's gender that matches their own as well, because I think this should be standard for every player to LARP. Get pronoun pins. They're a helpful aid to other folks and can help folks feel integrated instead of stigmatized, because if it's only folks that are trans and non-binary wearing pins, then it's sort of, we'll point them out in a way that, like, if everyone's wearing their pins, that's like a much more safe environment, I feel. So I'm actually looking into getting some pins for myself for purposes of LARPing. It's really great to sort of set that standard for integration as an ally, and it's just good, for players to have them as a tool. Now, as I said, I've seen a lot of my friends explore, gender expression and their gender itself at games. And so I have some advice if that's something that you're maybe looking to do. First of all, make sure the local game is friendly towards folks exploring gender expression. A lot of games will have statements about this right in their terms of service. Like, generally, what I'm saying is they would have positive ones. If they have negative ones that are like transphobic or whatever, obviously don't go to that kind of game. I wouldn't go to that kind of game. And, I don't imagine anyone watching this would want to as well. And that's a good sign when you find those kind of terms of service. uh, that's something you want to look for, because it's a good sign, and you're more likely to be well received there than in a game that's like more of like a good old boys type of game, because those can get really clubby and they tend not to be as sort of progressive in how they accept and treat other people. And I don't think anyone who's watching Craft of Gaming here really wants to associate with a place that's not accepting of others. I would like to think that my audience is kind of where I'm at, or hopefully they're even more thoughtful about it than I am. I mean, that's I always open myself to correction or suggestions here. This is actually part of why I took the questions, and this was honestly kind of a risk for me, like taking these questions and answering some really hard questions. I have a chance of having a bad take here, and if I do, please, call me out in comments or say something to me on Facebook. I'll either, publish a correction to what I should say, or a consideration of it, so that I can, I can better help the community that I love so much. All right, number 2, in terms of the things you should do while doing gender expression, or just exploring gender at a LARP, is if you can have some friends who are aware of what you're doing going with you, so that you have some allies to advocate for and with you if someone is trying to like harm you or disrupt your play by mistreating or misgendering or otherwise acting in a poor way towards you. So you're not just there by yourself. You have a friend who can go like, hey, that's not cool, back off. In addition to having like, obviously you'll to some extent be depending on staff if someone does that, but having a support group around you when you're taking a step like that, I think is a really solid choice. And obviously that's not applicable for everyone. Maybe you're going to a place where you don't know as many people, but if you can do it for your own sake, I think it would be wise to do so. 3. As goofy as it sounds, and I know I approve of this, but one of the other areas you can explore, in addition to like your classic tabletop and LARP, we can deal with gender expression. I've actually seen, and my first sort of experiences with a lot of trans and non-binary folk were actually through things like online roleplay, LiveJournal, Dreamwidth, Insane Journal games, and that kind of game is wonderful, because you're gonna you have a chance to sort of come out and deal with things through roleplay, through the internet, where it's in some ways more anonymous, and it's very easy to be accepted in those kind of communities. They tend to be very accepting to begin with. So I do recommend, if you want to try that, also look at like the online role playing. That's also a good way, just sort of to get your feet wet. Number 4. Now, number 4, part of my response to this is kind of a sadder part, but I think it needs to be said. Be ready for that pushback from nasty players. It's more likely, I would say, at a LARP than at a tabletop, where everyone is, I would argue, probably more likely to be your friend, or at least a well-disposed acquaintance. Have your support system in place. Have a rejoinder or a withdrawal plan if people are mistreating you in ways that you can't immediately deal with. I don't want to come across as negative towards, folks exploring gender and gender expression in gaming. I think it's great. But being ready for other folks not being receptive, and being ready to shut down their arguments and treatment is the best way to make sure that your enjoyment and your exploration is as unharmed and as successful as possible. So, come prepared. Sometimes the world is a hostile place, and, be ready to, defend your expression, and, have friends that are ready to stick up for you as well. Nah. Next question, a little less heavy and one that I can really answer with less of a disclaimer than the previous one because this is something that is definitely my wheelhouse, which is how to be a combat PC at a LARP when you're timid and not typically a physical person. Now, I will admit this was a hard question for me to answer. I personally have almost always been a physical person, and I don't necessarily have the mindset to imagine myself not being that kind of person. But my advice is twofold. One, if you're in like a Boffer game, start with ranged combat, bows, packets, dart guns if allowed. All of these ways allow you to contribute to combat scenes and score big hits and feel awesome while still keeping you out of the engagement range of the fight sticks. It can be a little bit intimidating and kind of hurty sometimes. I'll be honest, I absolutely hated the sensation of combat my first few months at a Boffer LARP. It was painful for me, and while I got sort of a combat high, I initially flinched a lot because I hadn't done anything with martial arts since I was like in my teens. So getting into the engagement range of another human being and swinging at them with even, theoretical, harmful intent, even if it's just for like game purposes, is something of a difficult bridge to cross. So you kind of have to get used to it. So here's another way to deal with that. Immerse yourself in it with friends you trust outside of game. Have them practice with you. Make sure they're hitting you safely, obviously, as they would at LARP, so you understand the feel of a latex, boffer, or whatever hitting your skin, so your own physical reactions are trained for that. Well, like parrying, eating it instead of, flinching or curling up. It's going to take time. It's going to take patience and sometimes a lot of failure, but eventually you'll learn how to take hits and deal them out. Make sure you're with compassionate people. Optimally, someone with a boffer fighting experience and mental health professional background who has dealt with people who are fight shy for various reasons before is best. But not every situation is going to be an optimal one. But make sure it's someone at the bare minimum that you really trust to be safe with you before you try that kind of immersion. Another thing is, once you're maybe a little more comfortable with the idea of doing, that kind of combat, so you like wade in and you fight for a while, you might find yourself freezing. Like you've hit your hard limit, and it's like, the combat's not over. Don't be afraid to go sticks down and get the heck out of combat. Not because I'm like, you shouldn't do it because you're bad at it. No, because in a well-run game, no one is going to question you out of game for getting overwhelmed and knowing your own limitations, and getting tired or otherwise mentally unable to deal with it and taking a break. Like, it is so acceptable to do that. I can't say enough. For your own safety and peace of mind, if you feel yourself getting overwhelmed, remove yourself from the situation as quickly as possible, because the most important thing beyond like any ongoing narrative of the combat is to make sure that you as a player are safe and happy. And if that means, realizing, this is too much for me, pull back from the scene. That's there for you, and it should be there for you. And another bit of advice for helping yourself with timidity and fighting. I know this worked for me when I was initially fight shy. Armor up. No, really, there's a sense of invincibility, or at least protection, that comes from costume or real armor that you wear into the field, and a kind of override or at least soften the foreboding or concern you can get going into a combat encounter. I personally love it because it lets me immerse myself in the persona of a character by putting their armor on, and because it cushions stiff blows on a cold day, or if someone gets a little too excited or whatnot. So there you go. There's some of my advice for how to deal with, combat timidity. It's a hard thing to ramp up to that. Engage it sort of in layers. Try ranged first, and just, it's like getting into a pool. You don't always necessarily want to jump into the deep end. Working your way in slowly is perfectly fine, and no one should judge you for doing so. And if they do, well, that's their problem, not yours. Your goal is to, find the level of enjoyment and engagement with, boffer combat that's important for you. And if you find out even after you try it that's something you don't want to do, that's perfectly legitimate. But if you really, really want to go into it, take some of the advice I recommended, Especially like the armor one is really good. Like armor is such a great psychological aid. So next question. How do you find a queer-friendly LARP that protects its players? Gosh, I'm getting all the hard questions from Andy. I appreciate you so much. You are the coolest in so many ways, and I'm so glad that I listened to your podcast, Ending Pending, also with Ronnie and your partner. Man, wow, I really like it. But that's neither here nor there. It's just me plugging you. Wow. Look at a couple of things. First, any statements in the rule book itself about respecting queer identities and people. That's important. You want a LARP that starts by acknowledging their personhood and that it's a safe space for them. The second thing you do is you check to see if any members of the operating staff are queer. This may sound silly, but it's important to seek that kind of diversity in staff because you want folks in power who can relate on a personal level to queer folks and won't unconsciously hold biases or run things in a way that are non-inclusive accidentally. This is important on a couple of levels because not everyone is out of the closet for personal, family, or professional reasons, and you want the LARP to protect players first and foremost. Honestly, a big part of that is going to be networking with your queer friends. Where do they feel safe? Honestly, if I'm going to go to a LARP that I know to be a queer friendly place, the first ones that come to my mind are going to be Stardust, Colony Alpha, and Lost Colonies. This is partially because I know a lot of the players and a lot of the staff that go there. I know they have queer staff. So that kind of bad behavior, which we've seen at the past at other LARPs, is much less likely to happen. And, obviously it's not going to fly. In terms of this, I'm also given to understand Velvet Noir is excellent, but I have less first-hand experience with the people running it. But every report I've heard from those that have gone has been excellent, so I can at least contingently recommend that LARP as another place that's safe. Beyond that, I'm not saying any of the other places that I've attended are not that way necessarily. They're just the ones that jump out at me as yes, there's like a definite positive feeling about those places in the community, and I will recommend them first and foremost if that's a big concern. Again, ask around the community. There's a strong whisper network underlying most of the LARPs I've been to, and if a LARP is failing the community, it will come out sooner or later. Just make sure you cast a wide net, because some folks are very much ensconced in one LARP or another and might knowingly or unknowingly turn a blind eye to bad behavior elsewhere because of their own success, within their LARP because of their own significant investment in it. I'm not saying this is a criticism of any particular LARP or group of people, just something that I've learned through, unfortunately, hard lessons from years in the gaming world. Last question. This one is from Brandon Williams, my bro, my gun bro, my sword bro, we bros. You get it. I think I'm wearing a shirt that you got me. Wait, no, someone else got me the shirt, but no, I wish I was wearing my Sunbro shirt, but I lost it. Sorry, Brandon. So how do you deal with bleed from LARPs or tabletop gaming? Gosh, this is important too. Bleed can affect a lot of things, and in certain circumstances, outbleed from, the LARP back to you. It can be real pressure on your mental health. While LARPing can be very cathartic, it can also be very stressful. So returning to your normal world after a weekend or more of being someone else is very, very important. So I talk about the bleed with my friends, not just, wow, we did cool stuff this weekend. Because obviously, while that is important for your debriefing and continued enjoyment of a LARP, it's, not necessarily the point. You need to talk about how a LARP has affected you emotionally, how those emotions are carrying into both your character story and, obviously the physical effort of that kind of emoting and role play can also, be a physical stressor on you. So develop a cycle for decoupling from the LARP. The post-LARP shower is, of course, a big thing, but also getting home and eating a good meal, listening to music that isn't necessarily game-related. I know we all have our character playlist, and gosh, I love that, listening to them. But, you want to listen to some other music that sort of signifies the end of a LARP. I have a particular song that I always listen to as I'm driving home from LARPs while the sun is going down. It just sort of indicates that I'm returning back to like a reality that I've sort of left for a while. Also, watching a television show or a good book that you enjoy is a good way of centering yourself in the real world and connecting yourself to your own emotions again. There's another big thing: mindfulness of your own state of mind and self monitoring, as well as having a friend monitor and listen and be willing to call you out on your actions, which you're taking maybe because of bleed, is important. Have at least one friend outside of the LARP who is keeping an eye on how you react to stuff in the days after an emotionally intense LARPing session or an emotionally intense tabletop, although I've found that you tend not to get quite as full body immersed in tabletop as you do in LARP, so it's less of a concern. But just keep that someone there to keep you honest. Now, I mentioned debriefing. Debriefs are used in some LARPs nowadays. I've seen it done in a couple of places. Most of the LARPs that I go to don't use a debriefing, and I don't consider that a criticism of them. They tend to be very traditional buffer LARPs for the most part, so that's not really a thing that is necessarily culturally done. But, in some of the other kinds of LARPs it is, and I think that's great. It's a good thing, though. Discussing the game after playing it, how emotionally affected you, how you're going to move forward with that. That's good stuff. And I think it's important we consider just debriefing informally among our friends so we can consider the kind of emotions we played with. I know I had some intense emotions during, say, the Homunculi arc, which was played out at my Night Realms, story told by Matt Marjack. And I damn well did do some brief debriefs for that to work through my feelings with folks like Jason Feldman and the like, to try to figure out, what was game, what was Bill, and how I should move through and negotiate the experience of life after very intense role-playing experiences, because that was a big deal. Another suggestion for dealing with that sort of, outbleed after the game is if you're seeing a mental health professional for therapy, talk to them specifically about gaming and about those feelings you're taking away or maybe even bringing into it. Like that, as weird as it sounds, I know it can be a hard ask to like explain to your therapist, what's live action role playing or what's a tabletop game. I think it's important so that they can kind of get a feel for where your mindset is and they can help you through that. Now, all of this has been talking about the outbleed of LARP emotions into your life. But you can carry big emotions with you into LARPing, feelings about other people, feelings about yourself, and feelings about life. These can really inflect or infect your roleplay. To a certain extent, that's utterly understandable, especially if you write characters like I do to explore questions that you're interested in. The big thing to watch out for is letting your characters, which you've created, explore them in their own way. And while you're always steering them to some extent, don't let your rough day at the office unnecessarily make decisions you find to be out of character for the character you've created. Much as I talked about decoupling rituals, find an immersion ritual for yourself before you play a character. Listen to music that relates to them, write for them, that kind of thing. Now, let's be clear. You're never going to completely separate your own attitude and mind from that of a character, but you can remove and sort of abrade some of it beforehand to give them as much chance to live their own life as possible. Now, some folks view LARP as a catharsis, as a sort of supplemental therapy, and obviously it is a way to explore emotions and stuff that we have. And that's okay, because LARPing and gaming is a very intense hobby. You're bringing a lot to the table, and that can make things great, as long as we keep some room for our character and ourselves to be themselves. Like, I'm not saying extreme separation is important. It's not always, but having some lines for yourself is good, and it's healthy. Now, tabletop games tend to have less bleed issues for the simple reason of it tending to be less of an immersive environment. You're always keeping one eye on the mechanics or your pizza or whatnot, so I covered them less. But you can get very invested in those games too. Goodness knows I am in people like Var, Vor, Adara, all my other tabletop characters. I'll probably talk about them more in a later episode. But this one is to an end. I look forward to answering more questions in the future, although it does tend to make for a longer episode because I'm pretty much doing like one episode's worth of content for each question I answer. So this is going to be kind of rare. Thanks again for those who, care about such things. Happy Thanksgiving. Obviously, this holiday is kind of fraught for a lot of reasons. Remember please, what happened to the Native Americans in the aftermath of their initial welcoming of the Pilgrims and other colonists. It's not a great situation. But, I don't want to be like a spoil sport or anything in terms of like, wishing people well on what is a holiday. I hope to speak to you all again soon about gaming. And I would say, like and subscribe and ring the little bell if you would, if this is content you're interested in. I will endeavor to be more regular in my updates. Obviously, that's dependent on me being physically healthy, but I imagine that's going to be better in the future. I love you all. Look forward to interacting with you all again through questions and answers. Peace out. This is Bill. And that's Craft of Gaming.